Hello my dear curious and studious students of surgery, myself Dr. Mahesh Chaudhary. I am warm welcoming you in my surgery lecture series. This surgery lecture series contains entire surgery with anesthesia, with radiology, with orthopedic. So stay tuned with us. Let's start our surgery lecture series. Welcome again my dear students, the hernia. In this lecture, we will cover the common external hernias, the etiology of the hernia, pathology of the hernia, classification of the hernia, strangulated hernia and inguinal hernia. So let's start with the hernia. What is the hernia? A hernia is an abdominal protrusion of a part or a whole of the viscus through an abdominal opening in the wall of the cavity which contains it. In this lecture, we are only concerned with the external abdominal hernia. An external abdominal hernia is a protrusion of the abdominal viscus through a weak spot in the abdominal wall. The common external hernias are inguinal, about 73% contributes, femoral 17%, umbilical 8.5%. To only these three types of the inguinal hernia contributes 98.5% of the total external hernias. And incisional hernia, its incidence is not included because it is the iatrogenic. Other 1.5 cases are rare, that is the epigastric, lumbar, pigalian, obturator and gluteal. Dear students, here is a good image on your screen that showing the various external hernias on the abdominal wall, that is the epigastric hernia, incisional hernia, direct hernia, umbilical hernia, indirect hernia and the femoral hernia. All the hernial sites are shown in this image. Now the etiology, mainly two factors play in causing a hernia: weakness of the abdominal muscles and increased abdominal pressure which forces the content out through the normal abdominal musculature. Weakness of the abdominal muscles. One A is a congenital and second is a acquired. Congenital weakness, persistent of the processus vaginalis, causes indirect complete inguinal hernia. And second, similarly, patent canal of the nuck in females causes indirect complete inguinal hernia. And the third etiology is the incomplete obliteration of the umbilicus may lead to the infantile umbilical hernia. Now second B is the acquired weakness. Extensive fat in the abdomen causes weakness of the abdominal musculature fat. Fat separates muscle fibers, causes direct inguinal hernia, paraumbilical hernia and hiatus hernia. Next point is the muscle weakness followed by the repeated pregnancies due to the relaxation of the abdominal muscles. Surgical incision may lead to division of the nerve fibers, causes muscle weakness. For example, a direct hernia may develop following appendicectomy due to division of ilioinguinal nerve. Next point is the incisional hernia develops through the weakened abdominal muscles, mostly protection in the early post-operative period or excessive fat in the abdominal wall predisposes incisional hernia. Now the second etiology is the increased abdominal pressure, that is whooping cough in the children, chronic cough in bronchitis and tuberculosis etc., bladder neck obstruction or urethral stricture, enlarged prostate causing dysuria, powerful muscular efforts or straining during lifting heavy weight, vomiting, repeated pregnancy and constipation. Now the pathology of the hernia. A hernia consists of three parts. One is the sac, second is the content of the sac and third is the covering of the sac. First is the sac. Hernial sac is a pouch of the peritoneum which comes out through the abdominal musculature. Four parts of the sac are there. One is the mouth, second neck, third is the body and fourth is the fundus of the neck. Mouth. The opening of the sac contains enter in the sac. Neck, most constricted part of the sac. Here is may be the possibility of the fibrous band. Body, main portion of the sac. Body of the sac is the main portion of the sac. And the fundus, which is the most redundant part of the sac. Now the second point is the content of the sac. The viscus which lies within the sac of the hernia is called the contents of the hernia. Depending on the contents, the hernia is variously named, that is the omentocele and epiploccele, the content is omentum. If enterocele, the content is the loop of intestine. Richards hernia, portion of the circumference of the intestine. Littress hernia, content is the mecal diverticulum. Medley's hernia, two loops of the small intestine remains in the manner of the W shape, is called Medley's hernia. Portion of the bladder is sometimes present in the direct or sliding inguinal hernia or femoral hernia. Ovary without fallopian tube. Fluid, slightly fluid is almost always present, more in ascites and blood stain when hernia is strangulated. Now the third point is the coverings. Coverings of the hernia or sac are the layers of the abdominal wall which cover the hernial sac. These include the skin and the muscles of the abdomen. Now the classification of the hernias, there are multiple types of the hernia like reducible hernia, irreducible hernia, obstructed, that is the incarcerated hernia, or strangulated hernia, inflamed hernia. First we see reducible hernia. When a hernia reduces itself as the patient lies down and can be reduced by the patient or by the surgeon, that is called as the reducible hernia. And what is the irreducible hernia? When the contents of the hernia cannot be returned back to the abdomen by the efforts by patient or by the surgeon, that is called as the irreducible hernia. And in this, the internal ring of the hernial sac is very tight, and there is a high chances of the it convert in the strangulated hernia, so that is called as the irreducible hernia. Various causes of the irreducibility, that is the adhesions of the its content each other, adhesions of contents with the sac, narrowing of the neck, pressure of the omentum in the sac, massive hernia inside the scrotum and scrotum abdomen. Femoral and umbilical hernia are often irreducible. Irreducible hernia is dangerous and may lead to strangulation. Obstructed or incarcerated hernia, it is the irreducibility plus intestinal obstruction. Obstructed hernia means that the hernia is associated with intestinal obstruction due to the occlusion of the lumen of the bowel. Features of the obstructed hernia: expansile coughing impulse is not present. Patient does not complain of pain. The hernia is irreducible. The hernia is lax and not tender. Features of the intestinal obstructions. Now, the next point of this lecture is the strangulated hernia. Irreducibility plus obstruction plus arrest of the blood supply of the content, that is called as the strangulated hernia. Content becomes gangrenous. Neck of the sac is very much constricted. Pathology: in the interstitial, the venous return is first impeded. The intestine becomes congested and bright red. Serous fluid is seen oozing out into the sac. As venous stasis increases, the arterial supply is also impaired. Ecchymosis appears in the serosa. Serous layer becomes dull and covered with fibrinous exudate. Gradually the intestine loses its tone and it feels flabby. The variability of the intestine diminishes, and this favors migration of the bacteria through the intestinal wall, and the fluid the sac becomes full of the bacteria and toxins. In places of gangrene, the color changes from the purple to black. Clinical features: pain and vomiting. Such pain will only cease with the onset of gangrene and paralytic ileus. Dear students, here is a good image of the strangulated hernia, clearly seeing the hernial defect in the abdominal wall, the strangulation, there is a tight fibrous band or twisted of the intestinal loop, and the discoloration of the intestinal loop is clearly seen, that is the dark purple and black color of the intestine which is strangulated, and in the abdominal content intestine is normal in color. This is the another picture of the strangulated hernia, clearly seen the black and dark purple colored strangulated loop of the hernia intestines. Now the last point of this lecture is the inguinal hernia. The inguinal hernia means the protrusion of the part of the contents of the abdomen through the inguinal region of the abdominal wall. This inguinal region is a weak part of the abdominal wall by the presence of the inguinal canal, the deep inguinal ring and the superficial inguinal ring. The inguinal ring. The inguinal canal is a triangular slit almost horizontal in direction which lies just above the inner half of the inguinal ligament. It commences at the deep inguinal ring and ends the superficial inguinal ring. In infants, the superficial and deep inguinal ring are almost superimposed and the obliquity of the canal is slight. In adults, the inguinal canal about 3.5 cm, that is the 1.5 inch long, and is directed downwards and medially from the deep to the superficial inguinal ring. This canal has been developed due to the descent of the testes in the embryonic life. Dear students, you can see the image on your screen, that is the normal abdominal wall, normal internal deep rings. Here is the second image showing the inguinal hernia into the scrotum, and third is the inguinal hernia into the canal. Now the text image on your image showing the direct hernia and the internal ring clearly seen, the rectus muscle, the iliopubic tract, the fascia iliac, the femoral artery and the femoral vein. The anatomy is clearly seen in this picture. Now the deep inguinal ring, it is an opening in the fascia transversalis 1.5 cm, that is the half inch above the mid inguinal point and the mid point between the symphysis pubis and the anterior superior iliac spine. It is of an oval shape, the long axis being vertical. It varies in size in different individuals and is much larger in the male than in the female. At its margin, the fascia transversalis is the condensed. Medially, it is related to the inferior epigastric vessels. It transmits the spermatic cord in the male and the round ligament of the uterus in the female. Now, the boundaries of the inguinal canal: anteriorly skin, superficial fascia, aponeurosis and of external oblique; posteriorly transverse fascia along the whole length; in the medial half, conjoined tendon, combination of the internal oblique and transverse muscle and reflected part of the inguinal ligament; above, arched fibers of the internal oblique and transverse abdominis before the fuse to form the conjoined tendon. Below or the floor is formed by the grooved upper surface of the inguinal ligament and its union with the fascia transversalis. At its medial end, there is a lacunar ligament. Content of the inguinal canal are the ilioinguinal nerves in both sexes, that male and female. It pierces the internal oblique muscles and enters the inguinal canal and lies below the spermatic cord to accompany it through the superficial inguinal ring. Spermatic cord in male and round ligament of the uterus and the remnant of processus vaginalis in the female. Coverings of the spermatic cord. When the testis descends through the abdominal wall into the scrotum, it drags its vessels and nerves along with its ductus deferens. These structures meet at the deep inguinal ring and form the spermatic cord. These coverings form within the outwards are the internal spermatic fascia, cremasteric fascia and the external spermatic fascia is a thin fibrous membranous. Structures of the spermatic cord. The main constituents is the vas deferens. Arteries of the spermatic cord are testicular artery, artery of the vas deferens and artery of the cremaster. Pampiniform plexus of the testicular veins. Lymph vessels of the testes. Nerve testicular plexus of the sympathetic nerves. All these are the structures in the spermatic cord. Now the Hasselbeck triangle. Medially, there is the outer border of the rectus abdominis muscles. Laterally, the inferior epigastric vessel and below medial part of the inguinal ligament. It is a weak spot of the abdominal wall through which the direct hernia protrudes. Now the mechanism which prevents hernia in the inguinal region. Defensive mechanism which prevents hernia to occur. First, obliquity of the inguinal canal. Where there is a rise in intra-abdominal pressure, the posterior wall is opposed to the abdominal wall and thus anterior wall and thus prevents coming out of the abdomen contents through the inguinal canal. Second mechanism to prevent the hernia, inguinal hernia, that is the shutter mechanism of the arch fibers of the internal oblique and the transverse abdominis will bring down these muscles towards the floor when they are contracted and during rise of the intra-abdominal pressure. Third mechanism which prevents the hernia in inguinal region, that is the ball valve action of the cremasteric muscles, which pulls up the spermatic cord into the canal and plug it during rise in the intra-abdominal pressure. Fourth mechanism is the in front of the deep inguinal ring, there are strong fibers of the internal oblique. This prevents entry of any abdominal contents through the deep inguinal ring. Strong conjoined tendon is there in front of the Hasselbeck triangle to prevent the direct inguinal hernia. Dear students, you can refer a good textbook are available. You can refer them to clear your concepts. Here is the end of our surgery lecture number 42. Thank you.